Good morning, everyone. I'm Byron Radcliffe. I'm the Executive Vice President of the QED Group, and I'm the Chair of the Board of SID Washington. And I would like to welcome you today to the 2016 SID Annual Conference. We have approximately 850 people attending today, which is a great crowd, and we hope you all enjoy the program we put together. In developing this year's conference, we really tried to focus on voices outside of the Beltway. And we think we've achieved this quite well. For example, the Society for International Development is a network of chapters, and with Washington, D.C. being the largest of the chapters and the oldest. And participating in today's conference are 4 of our international chapters. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce those people very quickly. Let's see, Norbert Neusert from SID Frankfurt. Renee Domasant from SID Haiti. Nitzan Horowitz from SID Israel, who we don't think is here yet. And Arthur Marilla from SID International Rome. So welcome. So in addition to our counterparts from other SID chapters, we have speakers on our various breakout panels from all over the country, as well as a representative from Secours Islamique in France, which was brought to us today by the French Embassy. Kenya is also well represented today in that our keynote speaker and our Rice awardee are both from Kenya. You'll hear more later this morning about the extraordinary woman who we have designated as our Rice awardee, but now I'd like to just focus on the keynote speaker. Joe Agutu is speaking to us today about his company, his country, and more. Joe is the Director of Strategy and Innovation for Safaricom and also the chair of the Safaricom Foundation. And Safaricom is a wonderful model of how companies should and can work to help improve people's lives in the countries in which they operate. Joe has served for the last 25 years in the telecommunications industry, with the last 10 being in Safaricom, and was instrumental in the telecom reform in Kenya. The Safaricom Foundation is one of the largest corporate foundations in Kenya, which has dispersed over $21 million to date in health, education, economic empowerment, the environment, music, culture, and has also responded to disasters and humanitarian emergencies. The mission of the Safaricom Foundation is to build communities and transform lives. Similarly, the Safaricom company shares those same values. And in their corporate literature, they state, "We are dedicated to transforming the lives of our customers, communities, and colleagues. We pride ourselves in our track record of the same, and we know that this is just the beginning and will continue to work collaboratively to impact positively the lives across the country and beyond." Safaricom cares about creating jobs and changing lives. And I know that everyone in this room and their organizations share the exact same feelings for the work we do in development. That is to build communities and positively transform lives. So here to tell us more is Joe Agutu. Joe?
A very good morning to you all, and many thanks for this invitation that we should be able to join you here in Washington to share our experiences about some of the things that we are doing in Kenya. My boss, Bob Collymore, sends his greetings. He'd have loved to be here this morning to be with you. Indeed, he was the original invitee for this session, and he is engaged in investor roadshows, so he was not able to come here. A lot has been said about Safaricom, and often we ask ourselves, why is it that we seem to be punching above our weight? Now, Safaricom, actually in global terms, is a very small company. We came into being in the year 2000 as a joint venture between Vodafone PLC of London and the government of Kenya. The ownership structure now is 40% Vodafone, 35% government of Kenya, and 25% offered on the stock exchange. So we've been very fortunate. The company has grown very rapidly, and currently we revenues of about $2 billion US, in spite of the fact that there's been a general slowdown in the economy. Our market value currently is at $7 billion, which makes us the biggest company in East Africa by market capitalization. Last year, we became the first company in the region to release the True Value Report, which reviewed what we've been able to achieve beyond the financials and to the social value that our business generates. The report, which was compiled by KPMG, revealed that Safaricom actually sustains over 680,000 jobs and generates up to $3.1 billion into the Kenyan economy, which is about 6% of GDP. So as our business has grown, it has also become necessary for us to think, what is it that is making us sustainable? Do we find purpose in what we are doing? Is there something greater than simply maximizing shareholder value? And what is indeed our purpose? So that's a question that we've constantly been asking ourselves. For the last 15 years, Safaricom has had a clear vision, which is to transform lives. This is our purpose, and this is what drives us. It may sound a little idealistic. It may sound as something that is nice to say, but for Safaricom, it means that we've had to redefine our approach to business to make this a reality. It means that we've been able to go beyond the financial performance and see what our impact is on the communities that we serve. It means that we can actually focus on restoring dignity and being a source of strength to the vulnerable and those who are disempowered around us. It means unlocking potential, be it a small business that is trying to get off the ground or a young graduate that is trying to start up in business. Transforming lives means striving to innovate so that we can improve the quality of life and create opportunities for Kenyans from all walks of life to find their purpose. It means not being afraid to advocate for change and drum up support on issues that you'll not find corporates or private sector engaging in. We've talked very boldly about governance in Kenya. We've talked about children's rights. We've talked about female genital mutilation. These are issues as a company that we've engaged in quite boldly. Transforming lives means we have to take some long-term decisions, even at the risk of short-term gains. Transforming lives means that at the core of our business, we must find purpose, and therefore we must build the structures that actually make us fit for purpose to achieve our goal. So emerging technologies actually make it very difficult for you to remain competitive because your competitors will copy very quickly what you're doing. So it has to go beyond your products and services. There has to be something that actually gives you an affinity, a connection, and a bond with your customers. That is what will give you the edge. And this is not to say that we have not had challenges with our customers. I can tell you now, because of social media, every day we hear what our customers are saying. We are far from offering them a service that they can be proud of. But ladies and gentlemen, the mobile telephony has caused a revolution, not just in Kenya, but also in Africa. It has become a transformative tool. The mobile phone has seen the continent being described as a mobile-first, truly mobile-first continent. The mobile phone has evolved from a mere communications tool to a device that actually now you can carry out trade, you can carry out transactions, and completely touch the lives of our people in Africa. Today, there are about 1 billion phones in Africa. It is projected that smartphones will increase to about 360 million in 2025. Now that is critical because with a smartphone, you can do much more than it is possible today on a feature phone. And so we can now talk about a connected worker. We can talk about a connected farmer. We can talk about a connected student. And with a connected student for Kenya, that is something that is soon coming to be a reality. You know, in North America and in Europe, you can take a lot of things for granted. You know, issues of safe drinking water, issues of quality education, issues of healthcare. Those you can take for granted, but in Africa, I can tell you these are daily challenges. We struggle with basic needs. We struggle with poverty eradication. We struggle with runaway unemployment. We struggle with the fact that there is lack of food, very basic things. We take the view, however, as a business, as Safaricom, we take the view that business cannot be a spectator. Business cannot stand by when, for instance, infant mortality continues to be on the rise. Business cannot be a spectator when student enrollment is low simply because there's no supportive infrastructure. We take the view that business has to be at the table when these issues are being discussed, not just to participate in the discussion, but actually to make a contribution towards solving some of the challenges that are facing our people. We can say we do not see any contradiction between maximizing shareholder value and engaging in issues that support the well-being of our people. And you can look at our financial results over the last 15 years. They've been consistently on the high, even as we've continued to engage on these social issues. In Kenya, our customers, every single day, there are about 8,000 to 10,000 people that are experiencing the internet for the very first time. So the mobile device becomes an important tool of accessing knowledge and accessing information by our people. This mobile revolution has opened up opportunities for entrepreneurs and has changed the way business is done on the continent, in agriculture, in healthcare, in education, and also financial inclusion. In Kenya, the mobile phone is much more than a simple communication tool. It is a tool for trade, as I've said before. It is now a bank. It is a means for financial transactions. And this goes back to 2007 when Vodafone and Safaricom came together to do a trial on mobile payments. Initially, in its very early form, this was supposed to be a means for paying microloans, assisting financial institutions, particularly the microfinance institutions, to collect their loans. But very soon it emerged, as we saw how our customers were behaving, that they themselves started sending money to one another. We also noted that even with the preloaded airtime, in our country, 97% of our base is actually prepaid. So we noted that they would also exchange their airtime using the phone. So this gave rise to what today has become known as M-Pesa. To deposit money in M-Pesa, you need to visit an M-Pesa agent, hand over your money, and get the value credited into your account. And this opens a world of opportunity. I've described it very, very simply. From this account, the customer can then send the money to someone else simply by following instructions that will come up on the phone, because the instructions are embedded in the SIM toolkit. So in 2008, just about a year after it was launched, there were 2 million customers who were using M-Pesa. And it became popular very rapidly because it addressed a need. In Kenya, particularly the semi-skilled and low-wage earners would wait for the 15th of the month when they've got their money, then go to some transport or a bus that is going to their home, they hand over an envelope, and that money goes to their wives who are at home. So there was already a felt need, a need to transfer money. And so when M-Pesa came, it became very easy for them, from the comfort of their rooms and so on, to send money to their spouses, to their loved ones at home. Of course, we don't say it, but there's a social study that was done that says that the men no longer go home as frequently as they used to, because now they'll send their money by M-Pesa. So the value of money transacted in M-Pesa is now equivalent to 85% of our national GDP. That is how rapidly this has grown. The penetration of our base, 90% of our 25 million customers are actually using M-Pesa, making it by far the most dominant mobile payment solution. To make M-Pesa work, you need agents so that your customers can access the service as easily and as quickly as possible. We have over 100,000 agents across the country. M-Pesa now also is now being used to purchase airtime. This is again very important for us because, as I said, we're a prepaid economy. Prepaid of our customers, 97% of them are prepaid. And so today, instead of buying airtime from our shops, they can also buy airtime from M-Pesa. And to tell you in terms of percentage, this has now grown to almost 45% of all the airtime sold is now sold through M-Pesa. A key feature of the success and growth of M-Pesa has been innovation, and innovation through partnership and collaboration with our partners. The banks in particular have been very, very keen to work with us. This was not always the case. It was, they were very negative at the beginning, but then now become extremely keen to work with us. Also, it has now been possible to pay bills, particularly the utilities. They are now being paid through M-Pesa. Today, over 2.6 million customers pay their bills using what we call Lipa na M-Pesa, which basically means pay by M-Pesa. And this service is available in over 44,000 merchant outlets. Lipa na M-Pesa today has become the biggest cashless service, even outsmarting the credit cards and the debit cards. So if you look in terms of numbers, US dollar billion in payments was made from all cards by February, but compared with 2.6 billion done on M-Pesa. Another M-Pesa success story beyond payment, as I've said before, has been banking. Now with banking, they are now able to give access to their customers to their accounts. So customers can move their money from M-Pesa to their bank accounts, or they can withdraw money from their bank accounts to M-Pesa, making also very easy for them to do their transactions, to pay for their goods and services without ever going to the bank. In 2012, we were in a partnership with a small corporate bank known as CBA. This bank had about 200,000 accounts, and together we started with them what we call M-Shwari. M for mobile, and Shwari, Swahili word for peace, Swahili word for calm. So this M-Shwari service has literally grown over the last 3 years from nothing to 13 million accounts today. A small corporate bank, 200,000 accounts over 3 years, growing to 13 million accounts, making them by number probably the biggest bank today. But that's not really the real story. The real story is that people are now able to borrow. They've got their accounts without ever going to a bank. They can now borrow from the bank without ever going to a bank, and particularly for small traders, borrowing small amounts, doing small trade has been very, very transformative. M-Shwari today has 13 million, as I've said, customers, but also in terms of deposits, they have 6 billion shillings in terms of deposits, but in terms of their non-performing loans, rate is just 3.7%, non-performing loans. And the reason why that is so low is because we have used some of the services and products that we have used that to be able to give credit or be able to assess credit worthiness of the customers. We have a service that is known as Okoa Jahazi. Okoa Jahazi is a service that allows a customer to borrow from Safaricom little amounts of money for airtime when they don't have that money or they don't have access to some of our shops. And then they borrow and they pay back with their next top up. Now, therefore, we've developed a very important database of the creditworthiness of our customers. And so that the bank uses this information to loan out to the customers as they apply. And as I said, because of that, the non-performing loan rate has been very, very low. International money transfer has also been launched with a number of countries. We would have wanted to move faster than that, but because of regulatory challenges, getting approval has not been easy. And so, according to FinAccess National Survey, it shows that the percentage of Kenyans receiving international remittances via their phone has now gone up to 49%. Of all the remittances, 49% are now receiving it by phone. We also have a lot of remittances between ourselves and our neighboring countries. And with Uganda and Tanzania, we now have about 31,000 transactions taking place every single day. My time is about gone, but let me spend a few minutes to comment on what we're also doing in other areas. I'll take just a few minutes to talk about what we're doing in energy, in agriculture, and in health. Very, very brief comments, so that you do not think that the only thing that we do is M-Pesa. In energy, Kenya has a power generating capacity of 2,300 megawatts to serve 45 million Kenyans. By comparison, California has 86,000 megawatts to serve their 45 million citizens. So even if the grid passes very close to your house, chances are that you'll pay about $400 to get a connection. But in a country where the average annual household income is about $750, $400 is a lot of money. The result, therefore, is that nearly 80% of our population has got no access to the national grid. And therefore, they pay about $7 a week to buy kerosene, to give them some light, and also to cook. And they end up in poor health because of the fumes that they inhale. So we partnered with a small company known as M-Copper, who developed a solar solution to light households. And it's basically a solar unit plus 3 lamps. Now, the unit also, the control unit has got a place for a SIM card. And therefore, using that, the household can make payments of about $5 cents per day to get light. So they end up using perhaps the same amount of money that we're using or less, but getting quality lighting. A very simple solution. You connect and you pay 5 cents a day to get quality light, and your children can study in a very good environment. So M-Copper has provided 125 million hours of fume-free lighting to 330,000 homes in the past 4 years at a cost of 5 cents, 5 US cents per day. In February this year, M-Copper introduced M-Copper Plus TV, both to existing customers and to new customers. For existing customers, they continue to pay that 5 cents per day, but now the period has been extended from 2 years by another 2 years. So 5 cents a day to be able to access quality TV and also some entertainment. At present, TV reaches about 31% of the adult population, so this leaves about 69% completely in the dark. And you can see what this will do to these families in terms of being able to get good light and now also to get some kind of entertainment. In future, M-Copper is looking to start even a facility that provides a solar stove and a solar fridge. In agriculture, as you know, is an important contributor to our GDP, but the problem has been that most of agriculture is by small-scale farmers who barely move out of subsistence farming. In Germany, agriculture contributes less than 1% to GDP. However, the output per worker employed in the agriculture sector is 100 times the output of their counterparts in Kenya. So through a number of partnerships, we are now providing information to the farmer on how to care for their cows, how to care for their chicken, and we give them veterinary information. We give them market and pricing information. And we wait to see how this will now impact our people. We've also partnered with the government of Kenya, and we're now launched what we call the e-fertilizer subsidy. And we hope that about 500,000 small-scale farmers will be able to access very affordable fertilizers. And with proper inputs, productivity will also go up. Regarding health, we have a maternal mortality rate of around 360 per 100,000 live births. Doctor-patient ratio stands at 1 to 17,000. So out of every 1,000 children born in Kenya, 49 will never be able to see their first birthday. Together with our partners, we have developed a mobile phone platform that educates expectant mothers and equips them with community healthcare volunteers with information that they can now start tracking the health of expectant mothers and pass this information to the nearest health facility. So the platform is going to provide government for the first time. They're going to have very key information about the life of a woman as she goes through her pregnancy. This project is currently being piloted in Samburu, and we're doing this with our partners, Farm Access. Is there anybody from Farm Access here? We really, really appreciate the partnership that we have with you, Farm Access Foundation, and together with AMREF Africa. So it's a pilot in Samburu, and if it works well, we hope we can be able to replicate this to other areas. There's also work that we're doing in medical insurance. Medical insurance is expensive, and we'd want the low those who earn low wages to be able to access quality health care. And it costs about $250 annually. That is at a minimum to get insurance, health insurance. And for workers who are earning about $54 per month, they will never be able to have access if the structures remain the same. So in this regard, we are also working with Farm Access Foundation together with KPAIR to launch what we call MTIBA. TIBA means treatment, mobile treatment. So we are looking again to see how we can offer good health care using this facility so that they can access very low insurance cost charges. And the thing that makes insurance that is, make it expensive is because of fraud in our country. So if we can offer a solution that cuts out fraud so that the employers can actually then put money there and they can see how that money is utilized, again, we hope this will be a turnaround in terms of quality healthcare to our people. So there's still so much that I could talk about. I've not talked about education. I've not talked about the things that we're doing with the youth. I've not said anything that we're doing with the pension for again, Jua Kali workers. I hope we can have this conversation even in the course of the day. But there's so much that we're doing, and I hope I've been able to convince you that business must be present when these issues are being discussed. And it is not going to hurt your P&L. If anything, it will add to your P&L. So if there's nothing that you've heard out of this discussion, please take note that business being involved in transforming lives does not hurt your bottom line. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Joe, for your comments. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. We have SID staff and volunteers out there with microphones if you raise your hand. If you could give your name and your company or affiliation before your question, that would be appreciated. And try to keep the questions a little bit short, just so we can get multiple questions in, okay? So, anyone out there with a question? Way in the back.
Thank you, and thank you for your time today. Kevin Murphy, President of J.E. Austin Associates. Could you discuss how rapidly your business model and this transformative change is filtering through other countries in Africa, not just the ones you work with, I think, in neighboring countries, but throughout other parts of Africa, and what you see as the policy or regulatory obstacles for this transformative change to take place in many more African countries?
Thank you very much for that question. I cannot claim that I know what is going on in other African countries. But what I can tell you for a fact is that a lot of companies are coming to us to see how we're doing what you're doing. We know that they're being challenged to use our model. I think the biggest fear is to overcome the fear that if you're doing something of social impact, it is going to affect your bottom line. I think that is the biggest fear. But our experience has been, let me repeat again, that our experience has been, if you do the right thing, the financial results will follow. Yeah? If you do the right thing, the financial results will follow. So we hope that those who are coming to us and to replicate what we are doing will find reason to take the courage and to start. In Kenya, I can talk about one bank, Kenya Commercial Bank, that has taken this bold step to start doing some of the things that we are doing. And one of the things they've recently done, they've put in, I think it is about a $2 billion fund to support the youth, to train the youth in entrepreneurship and to get them ready to go into business. And so, certainly in Kenya, we are seeing that some of the institutions are pursuing what we have been able to do over the last 10, 15 years.
Do you have a microphone down here?
Your last comment. Thank you. Neil Ghosh from Global Youth Initiative. Your last comment is music to my ears. I'm sure music to a lot of people's ears, that doesn't hurt the bottom line. So I have a comment and one quick question. The organization I spent my last 10 years, we introduced something called inclusive business. The idea was, how do you engage the low-income citizen in the value chain of a company? Not just as a consumer, but as a distributor, entrepreneur, and it was a success in a lot of countries, and it still is a work in progress. The question what I'm going to ask you is, what I have found, and I'm writing another article right now, I write once in a while, is there's a disconnect between the chairman or the chairwoman of a company and the business unit. We have signed MOUs and have talked to a lot of CEOs, very enthusiastic, what you just said. But when it comes to real time, the business unit shying away because they are not seeing the bottom line return in the next quarter or the next quarter.
Yes.
So one of my ideas I'm proposing now is it time now, not just a US company, but the African companies and global companies, to assign something called an inclusive business manager, which will not just look at the poverty alleviation part, but also look at the bottom line part, because that is the concern more and more we're hearing. The business unit is not in sync with the chairman or the CEO. Any comments on that?
You're absolutely right. Because the business units, they've got financial targets. They do not have social impact targets. So before they actually reach their targets, they'll give you a hard time in terms of what you'd want them to do to achieve social impact. That is true. But fortunately for us, we have had our two foundations, M-Pesa Foundation and Safaricom Foundation, to provide leadership in these areas where the business unit may not necessarily be quick to pursue. But recently we were looking at the sustainable goals, and we said, how do we make sustainable goals as part of our business, and therefore we can set objectives? And to our surprise, I think there are 3 goals, sustainable goals, that we are now going to incorporate into our corporate objectives, because they're actually no different from what we do on a daily basis. So I can't quite remember what the 3 are, but we are now deliberately looking at those opportunities where we can incorporate what may be social goals into our corporate goals, so that it doesn't provide a contradiction at all. But then finally, some of the things that we've been able to do, like M-Pesa, which was never intended to be a money earner at the beginning, rather than as a solution to meet the challenges that our customers were facing. That story now is that M-Pesa has now, over this period of from 2008 to now of about 9 years, is now contributing 23% to our revenues, from nothing to 23%. So there's a story there that what appears as not financially feasible today can actually turn out to be financially feasible and actually add to your bottom line. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you, sir. My name is Oke Ihedru from Arizona State University. Thanks for your comments. As M-Pesa and the services you provide begin to cross-border, what are some of the cross-border regulatory issues you face? And also, any attempts on the part of M-Pesa and your partners to develop cross-border regulatory regimes that will help facilitate the development of this innovative product in tandem with the regional objective of greater or deeper economic and financial integration. Secondly, could you comment on some of the risk management issues, particularly concerning personal information? You've described how you've accumulated a lot of information that your collaborators in the banking sector are now using to determine credit worthiness and so on and so forth. There is a concern about unethical use of personal information and also protection of that personal information. As you accumulate, you've seen a phenomenal increase in the number of customers now. What assurances can Kenyans have that this information cannot be hacked into or misused either by Safaricom, your partners, or any other individuals, either intentionally or unintentionally? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So first one on the regulatory issues, I think the biggest challenge that we face is anti-money laundering. That's a big issue, both in country and in cross-border transactions. So until you satisfy the authorities that you've put in place measures to ensure that you are taking care of anti-money laundering issues, they will not give you that approval. They have to be comfortable that you're dealing with that. And then, of course, the internal lobbies in country, just to make sure that what sort of regulatory regulatory challenges will that pose, and also in competition with the local institutions. Those are the issues that guide us, and those are the issues that were a challenge in Kenya before the M-Pesa was started, because the central bank had to be sure, that you will not flout any existing regulations, even though you're not licensed as a bank, and we're not licensed as a bank, but under what regulatory umbrella will you fit in? But it had to take the courage of the governor of the central bank then to say, let's start, we'll learn as we go along. So regulation has sort of followed the M-Pesa product, and a lot has gone on. But still, even now, we are not regulated as a bank. There's a whole different set of regulations, but we've not been regulated as a bank. Now, the question that you're raising about personal data, this is a wider issue in the mobile business. As we speak now, there's a whole lot being said about big data and the analytics that go with it. But the sanctity of personal information remains very critical and very prime. So for us as licensed mobile operators, there are certain things that we cannot share with third parties. It is very clear. But in this particular case is for credit worthiness to facilitate giving a loan. Yeah? So without actually revealing whom you've been talking to and what exchange of information you've been having, just saying that this person is credit worthy according to us. We don't think that will be flouting any privacy rules.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'd like to thank Joe for speaking to us. And he will be available during the break that is coming up. So I wish that we could all appreciate Joe. And now I'd like to introduce Catherine Rafelson, who is the president of SID Washington, who I'm sure most of you know, who will explain the rest of the morning.
Thank you, Byron. And thank you very much, Joe. So appreciate that you came here to speak to us today. I'm the very boring part of the program, very boring but very important. I'm here to tell you a little bit about today's program and to explain a few things so that you can make the most of your day. We've done a few things differently this year. I know a lot of you have come last year and in previous years, So the first thing is, in the wake of the Paris climate talks, we wanted to save trees and print a more earth-friendly program. So you probably all received this, and you're probably wondering, where are all the speaker bios and where are all the details? Well, they are on our app, and I forgot to bring my phone up here, but I hope that you all have downloaded the app or can download the app. In order to make it easier for you, we, at great expense, purchased Wi-Fi, and then the Wi-Fi passcode changed from the handout. So if you're having trouble with the Wi-Fi, just add another 16. The Wi-Fi passcode is SID-W 1616. I don't know why that happened, so I apologize. But on that app, you will find the detailed schedule for the day and all kinds of information, speaker bios, information on our sponsors, and in some cases, links to handouts for the breakout panels later. So I hope you can do that. The instructions to download the app are on the front of this. You all should have received this handout as well. Unfortunately, we weren't able to eliminate paper altogether. So this has some bare minimum information. It has your maps of the convention center, maps of this room and table numbers, which will become important later. So after we're done in the morning session this morning, the exhibit halls will be open across the way. We'll have a short break, and then the breakout panels will happen down the hall. And those will take place down near registration and around the corner, which is also a little different from previous years. The exhibit hall will be open until 5 p.m. We have some great exhibits, so I hope you'll go in and check that out. And then after the breakout panels, we'll meet back in this room for something we did last year. I know a lot of you were here for this. It's our topical discussion lunch. So that becomes open seating in here. And in this handout, you have the back section is several pages that lists, we have over 50 topics this year. And the way that works is 50 or so tables will have topics assigned to them and a facilitator. So you can look on here. You may want to look at it before lunch starts to decide what topics you're interested in, because it starts promptly and this room gets very busy and very lively and full. And if your table is full, you can probably find another topic you'd be interested in too, so maybe come up with your first few choices. That's a lot of fun, very noisy, but very fun. Then after that, we have our second set of breakout panels. And then then we'll have another break, and then we're meeting back in here for a really interesting closing session today. We're going to have a moderated discussion with Charles Kenny of the Center for Global Development and Steve Radelet of Georgetown School of Foreign Service, moderated by Tessie San Martin from our board. So I hope you can join us for that, and then a reception at the end of the day. Again, a lot of this information is on the app, and if you have any trouble with it, we do not have a genius bar, but we have a lot of very smart people with orange or green name badges, staff and volunteers that should be able to help you with that, because there's good information there. But before we go to our next speaker, we have a couple of very short speakers after this, and they're not short, but their talks are short. I want to take a minute to thank a few key people and organizations who really do make today's program possible. First and foremost, thank you to our sponsors. We have 46 sponsors this year. Once again, our exhibit hall is very full. Most of these sponsors have tables in the exhibit hall. I hope you'll all go in and see them. It's really, really fun and interesting. It's a wonderful mix of NGOs, private sector firms, consulting firms, government agencies, universities, representing our diverse membership. So we thank you all. Two sponsors have extended extraordinary support to us this year: Arizona State University over here and Tetra Tech over here. Thank you. And we want to take just a couple minutes to see a very short video about each of them.
The focus of ASU on global issues is derivative of our desire to enhance teaching, learning, and discovery for ourselves and everyone that we work with. Global problems are often the most challenging, often the most complicated, often the most transdisciplinary, which excites us. So most global partners are looking for transformative change. We are an institution that has made transformative change a central part of our internal genetics. This is not an institution built on tradition as its principal modality. This is an institution built on innovation. The way you solve problems anywhere is to build a learning environment around the problem, to use it as a teaching moment, and to use discovery as the mechanism by which you derive new solutions. If we're solving an engineering education problem in Vietnam or a renewable energy issue in Central America, we learn as much from implementing the project and from the people that we're working with than we already know. Research is really important as a way to engage with global issues and global problems because you're able to bring new perspectives and new approaches to solving particular problems. We are a knowledge enterprise. We create knowledge, store knowledge, synthesize knowledge, transfer knowledge. We do all of those things, and that can only be enhanced by the scale and nature of the complexity of the challenges which we encounter. These are highly activated master teachers and master scholars inside this knowledge enterprise where our product is not esoteric ideas. Our product is derived solutions that lead to particular outcomes, and that fundamental purpose for us, that commitment to all elements of society, all problems, all things that one can become engaged in. That sets us apart from other universities, working in ways that connect people around the world through mutual learning and mutual problem solving from which high levels of respect and understanding can be derived.
Thank you again to ASU and Tetra Tech. And finally, I want to thank the tiny but mighty SID Washington staff, all of whom labored all weekend on every detail of this event. And I want to thank Paul Weisenfeld, our annual conference chair, and our conference committee for their ideas, time, and guidance. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Paul Weisenfeld.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks to you and Byron for your leadership in putting this conference together. So you'll see in the program that we have lightning talks between the main sessions this year. This is a new innovation for the year. The idea is to have a rapid 3 to 5 minute intervention on a new and interesting topic, a mini TED Talk, so to speak. but with a focus on young people who are relatively new to the field of international development and who've demonstrated great energy and new ideas. So let me introduce our first TED Talk. The TED Talk is entitled Technology, Innovation, and E-Learning for International Development by Nick Martin. Nick is an educator, technologist, and social entrepreneur with experience in international development and peace building. He's the founder and CEO of Tech Change, a social enterprise that provides technological training for social change, and he's been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, and the PBS NewsHour. Nick was our 2014 runner-up for the SID Washington Rice Award, which honors an outstanding young innovator in the field of international development. You'll hear more about the Rice Award in a few minutes, so please join me in welcoming Nick.
And thank you, Paul. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you to everyone here at SID. I'm going to actually start with a question. My question is, raise your hand if you've ever taken an online course before. Raise them high. Wow, look around the room. That is pretty amazing. I am not going to ask if you finished those courses. I'm going to talk a bit about my journey as a young professional in international development. So I started out as a modern poetry major, and then worried that that degree was way too practical. Got a second degree in peace education. And then found myself back in Washington, D.C. without a job a number of years ago, so I teamed up with a group of fellow nerds, as you see here, and we were all very excited about the growth in global connectivity. 30% of the world having access to the internet, 90% of the world having access to a mobile device. But even more than that, it was the power of tech for good. Mobile phones being used to provide public health, social media tracking human rights abuses, digital maps being used to respond to disasters that got us excited. And yet, as we looked out over the world across so many sectors, we saw individuals who were hungry for new skills and new types of training. Now, these folks could not go to graduate school for reasons of cost or geography, and as we know in this field, sometimes putting a trainer on a plane to do a workshop can be very expensive and inefficient. So we asked ourselves, what about online learning? Well, you might be interested to know that the history of distance learning in this country dates all the way back to 1728 with the first correspondence course. In the 1920s, we had the first courses over radio, and in the 1960s, we had the first courses over TV. It wasn't until the 1994 that we had what we now consider the first online courses. So my colleagues and I, we took hundreds of online courses, Khan Academy, Code School, Udacity, Udemy, you name it, we took it. And what we found was a lot of this. One omniscient professor imparting his or her wisdom to the unassuming masses, a lot of long video lectures paired with endless quizzes. Maybe that's an okay model for teaching computer science, but it's really not ideal for tackling complex global challenges. We also came across studies like this one from Columbia University, which said that the most marginalized learners in an online course are the ones that need the most support, which I think really calls into question this notion of scale and access being the solution to all of our problems. We need to be thinking about support and quality in addition. So we brought together international development practitioners like yourselves, together with animators, computer programmers, and educators, and we said there's got to be a better way to do this, and that was the origin of Tech Change. We build beautiful and engaging online courses and topics that matter, and we're based right here in Washington, D.C. The building blocks of our model are as follows. We take high-quality animated content. We have a great animation on the story of M-Pesa, which some of you may be interested in. We take that content and we package it in the form of courses, both facilitated and self-paced. Those courses then ride on a state-of-the-art learning platform designed specifically for international development audiences, and then we capture some of the best learning data and metrics available today. We have a number of courses that you as professionals can take, things like technology for monitoring and evaluation, technology for data visualization. These are 4-week online facilitated courses designed for the international development community. We've had about 10,000 students from about 1,500 organizations take these courses in the last 5 years. And we've had the wonderful privilege of working with a number of partners, many of whom I see here, to take their content and build really beautiful and engaging online courses for audiences all around the world. One example, we worked with the Malaria Consortium to build a course in Uganda for 3,000 pharmacists on how to use rapid diagnostic tests to better treat and respond to malaria. As we think about our next steps, we're taking that software platform that we're building and we're trying to take it to the next level to capture new kinds of learning data and analytics, going beyond quiz scores and completion rates to thinking about how we track real-world impact and how we map the social fabric of a learning community. Who's talking to who and how are they making a difference in the world? So our passion is to take international development as far as it can go and combine it with all things we know about e-learning. If you share that passion, we would love to talk with you and work with you. I'm going to be here doing a learning lunch, but I'll be here throughout the day. Here's my contact information, and a big thank you to SID for all the wonderful and amazing support we've had over the years from you all. Thank you so much.
Good morning, all. I'm Chloe Schwenke, one of the board members of SID. Thanks to Nick, that was a wonderful presentation. My special assignment here is to speak on behalf of the Andrew E. Rice Award Committee, which is a really special opportunity for me. And I want to begin with something that Andy said. This was from 2006. I believe that the right path to a better world is expanding individual freedom combined with cooperative endeavor. Development at its best epitomizes this combination. On the one hand, it liberates the individual from poverty, ignorance, ill health, isolation, and cultural restraints on human dignity, while at the same time, it encourages common efforts to raise living standards and expand opportunity. Andy was one of the founders of SID, of which the DC chapter is one of but many around the world. Andy was also someone who was my mentor and my personal friend. I know that Andy's passion for international development was only matched by his determination that SID become an organization that would provide a unique space to discuss and debate the issues, challenges, and opportunities impacting international development. Andy is particularly remembered for his encouragement of young professionals to get involved in development and to accept the challenges for making the world a better place. Every year, the Andrew E. Rice Award Committee has a daunting but wonderful challenge. We must come through some truly remarkable applications and glowing references and decide on just one awardee. The choice is never easy. Each candidate brings inspiration to us as a committee and makes us very glad that we didn't have to adhere to that same high bar when we were their age. This year's review was no exception. My committee consisted of Alina Zajkowski, Paul Weisenfeld, and Debbie Kennedy Arahita, ably supported by SID staff Catherine Riffelson, Elizabeth Healy, and Lee McBain. Our committee also benefited greatly by the participation of Andy's son, Will Rice, who cannot be here right now, but will be joining us at lunchtime, so I encourage you to meet him. He's a wonderful person. We were all very impressed by every one of the applicants, but 3 really did stand out. 2 of those became our honorable mentions. Justice Uwayesu, through his life and work, serves as an exemplar of courage, resilience, humility, compassion, and energy. A child survivor of the Rwandan genocide, Justice has already had a positive impact through his development work in creating beneficial outcomes for some of the most marginalized people in his own country, and has inspired many, many people. Catherine Arnold, our other runner-up, is clearly a poised, thoughtful, articulate, and immensely dedicated young professional on a clear trajectory towards significant impact and leadership in the field of humanitarian response. No surprise, she's in Istanbul as we have this conference today. At this moment, and on behalf of the Society for International Development, Washington, D.C. chapter, I'm delighted to announce that the Andrew E. Rice Award for Leadership and Innovation by a Young Professional in International Development for 2016 goes to Dr. Nungari Mwangi of Kenya. She impressed all of us with the crisp and incisive clarity of her views on development, her comprehensive professionalism, and her depth of understanding of so many opportunities and challenges inherent in our field. We were also moved by her personal qualities of empathy, respect, and solidarity with the poorest and the most marginalized. She's already taken on extraordinary development challenges in the field in very difficult settings, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, among others. And through this, she has acquired that authoritative voice of someone who has dirt under the fingernails from extensive in-the-field engagement. She also brings some truly remarkable intellectual gifts and hard-earned skills to her work and her thinking. In short, she exemplifies all of the qualities of an outstanding young leader. Our awardee, please.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I want to give all the glory to God, for whom all good things come, for this award. To the Society for International Development, DC, thank you for your generous consideration and for this wonderful encouragement. To my family, all my gratitude and love for always and without fail holding me up and standing with me. I would also like to thank my referees, my PhD supervisor at the Center of Development Studies at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Shaila Jaffinal, and Edwin Macharia at Dalberg Global Development Advisors for acting on their faith in me and helping me swim in the deep end. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to have friends and teachers in my life who saw a spark and fanned it into flame. I come from a heritage of strong Kenyan women whose lives have been dedicated to strengthening their communities. My grandmother was ahead of her time. She was a women's empowerment officer in rural central Kenya in the 50s. In earlier colonial days, her older sister was a freedom fighter supporting the Mau Mau in the struggle for independence, and my mother has managed community development projects all over Kenya for decades. So that's where I come from. And so it was ingrained in me that leadership is about doing my best to first understand the complexities of the community in which I find myself, and to then commit myself to a more resilient, vibrant, inclusive, and prosperous society. In as much as we here in international development fora express development in terms of goals, the formulation of long-term strategies and metrics, at the heart of it, international development is, for me, driven by empathy, compassion, creativity, and critically service. It is about building bridges to elevate our common humanity against the odds. And so I believe that to truly transform, we must first locate voice and power in that which is local. It is this belief that has led me to do fieldwork in southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya at the beginning of my career as a humanitarian worker, and then in various parts of Eastern Africa as a development consultant working in agriculture strategy, and that has kept bringing me back even now as a PhD student in development studies. It is also in the field that I learned that innovation to development challenges begins with the humility to build a bigger table. That is, to find solutions in conversations across divides of power. The Minister for Agriculture, the smallholder farmer, the strategy consultant, and the policymaker sitting at a table discussing. Rather than speak for the underprivileged, we should be working to listen more honestly and elevate their voices so that the version of prosperity that we work to mold is true in both form and content. The beauty and pain of working in the development sector for me lies in its messiness, in the authenticity of the process, to the brokenness of being human. The triumph and reward of development work is to be found in our constant striving to envision a more inclusive future, to learn from history, to courageously deconstruct unjust epistemes, structures, and systems, and to build steadfastly and fearlessly on principle. I'm delighted that we have this unique opportunity here today in DC, together with the Society of International Development, to articulate the diversity of visions we have about our common humanity, and in so doing, to creatively and collectively speak life into them. I'm so humbled and honored to be among you today. Thank you all, and I look forward to learning from you. Thank you.
Our second lightning talk today is entitled Youth Voices. Why aren't we listening to a group of 621 million people around the world? This will be delivered by Banafsha Tasmim. Coincidentally, she happens to be from my own organization, RTI International. At RTI, she supports a number of youth and workforce development activities. Her passion for youth programs began as a young female skateboarder in Kabul, Afghanistan. She became the education coordinator for Skateistan, a program that uses skateboarding to engage youth in positive development and education. She eventually came to the United States in 2012 for graduate school, and she'll talk to us about her passion. Welcome, Banafsha.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. I'm Banafsha Tasmim. I am originally from Afghanistan, and I came to the US 3 years ago to study international development. I chose this field after working with a very unique program in Afghanistan called Skateistan. Skateistan is a skateboarding school that uses skateboard as a hook or tool to bring students to the school and then empower them through education and sports. Despite all the security challenges and obstacles, it has been a very successful program in Afghanistan with 50% female participation in the program, so Skateistan right now is the largest female skateboard facility in Afghanistan, and it has made Afghanistan a country with largest female skateboard percentage in the world. So Afghanistan has more skateboarders, female skateboarders, than the rest of the world. I work with them as their education coordinator for 3 years while I was in Afghanistan. After coming to the US, I served as their advisory board here in the US. So after graduating from a graduate school, I started working with RTI International with their new initiative called Global Center for Youth Employment. Global Center for Youth Employment represents 40 organizations that came together with the spirit of collective impact to infuse new innovations and tackle the challenge of youth unemployment worldwide. We believe that the global conversation around youth economic exclusion would benefit greatly from engaging with young people themselves. As you may all know, oftentimes researchers, policymakers, and the media fail to represent or do an in-depth representation of youth, whether it's stories of despair or success. Even the organizations that work with youth or seek to address their challenges often fail to have an in-depth understanding or insight into youth realities while designing their program. But I'm here and excited to share with you a new innovative initiative called Youth Voices. In 2016, the Ground Truth Project, RTI International, and the Global Center for Youth Employment, they launched the Youth Voices platform to give young people voices, and media, policymakers, and all those researchers a way to understand these voices. The Youth Voices program is a storytelling digital platform that gave young people opportunity to tell their stories, define their own lives to a global audience, and it puts young people at the center and forefront of conversation around youth economic challenges. We think it has the potential to re-engineer the global or international community's response to a job crisis. While the site is very new, it was launched in February 2016. We have 400 stories submitted to the site. Those stories will be used to raise awareness, and they will be highlighted by our publishing partners such as PBS NewsHour, Huffington Post, or ABC News. So we think amplifying youth voices has the power to challenge and change policymakers, compel public actions, and ultimately connect more young people to jobs, which is the ultimate goal. If you're a young person, go to the site and submit your story. If you're an adult, go to the site and listen to the stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating about skateboarding in Afghanistan. That's it for the morning. So get some more coffee. Go see the exhibits. The exhibit hall is open. Get down to the breakout panels by 10:30 because they will begin, and then we'll see you back in this room at 12:15 for lunch. Thank you, everybody.
I hope you found this innovation useful. The third lightning talk is entitled The Millennial Workforce and the SDGs, Asking Better Questions, and this will be presented by Ellie Price. Ellie leads the Young Professionals Network. Thank you. At FHI 360 that connects people with resources, networks, and relationships to find their sphere of influence in global development. Although she graduated only 2 years ago from college, she has a broad resume that includes experience working on projects involved with immigration and refugees, agribusiness, hunger and poverty, health governance, and she even co-founded a swim club in Uganda. She certainly makes me feel like an underachiever, so please welcome Ellie.
I'm starting a conversation today. We cannot achieve the SDGs without a power shift from the global north to the global south. But first, fast forward with me 10 years. It's 2026. Who's sitting in that decision maker's chair, looking at the time going, oh, look at the time. We've only got 4 more years to end extreme poverty by 2030. How are we going to correct course? It's not the same people who brought us the SDGs today. Chances are the people sitting in that decision maker's chair 10, 14 years from now come from that particular demographic that you either love for their fresh ideas and innovation, or you love to hate because they're known to be a little entitled and impatient. Yes, I'm talking about the millennial workforce. It's those millennials on their first post with the Foreign Service today, starting up tech firms in 2016. They're going to be the ones sitting right there 14 years from now, held accountable and responsible for the results of the SDGs. But what are we doing to prepare that workforce to be the type of leaders that we need sitting in that chair? I lead a young professionals network at FHI 360, and often what I hear people asking is, how do I get from point A to point B? How do I get into AID? How do I become a chief of party? Well, if in 14 years we're actually making progress against Goal 10 to reduce inequalities within and among countries, do I really want to see someone like me leading up a foreign aid project in Uganda? Frankly, no. So we've got to ask ourselves better questions if we want to have the type of leader sitting in that chair 10 years from now who will actually shift power from the global north to the global south. And I'll start by suggesting these three. First, how do we ensure that our ventures in social entrepreneurship actually put the target population into the driver's seat? You see, in our millennial disdain for dysfunctional American politics and our very sincere desire to make a difference in our day jobs, we are running towards social entrepreneurship. Yet we risk continuing to advantage Westerners who already have access to the best resources, the right social circles, and the right schools to push their ideas forward. There was recently this article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on this concept of social heropreneurship. This idea that today in Western culture, the social entrepreneur is viewed as this hero figure. So what you've got is these highly ambitious, high-performing Westerners getting into the best social impact-focused MBA programs, and then, not in all cases, but in some, they still end up designing solutions to problems that we've never actually lived. So, we've got to be careful not to create a parallel ecosystem to the aid industry that continues to elevate the ideas of Northerners and Westerners over the rest. So how do we ensure that our ventures into social enterprise actually shift power from north to south? 2, how might we fund reverse or two-way technical assistance? Again, transformation of mindsets only happens through experience. So imagine it's 2026 and the South African Ministry of Foreign Aid sends fresh graduates from Cape Town University to Washington, D.C. with $15 million to run a project. They've got to improve secondary education outcomes in D.C. public schools and create pathways to employment and income generation for disadvantaged American youth. What might our South African expat friends learn from the experience of development interventions suggested by outsiders? And what might local Washingtonians learn from them? I'm convinced that the lived experience can transform mindsets. So, how might we fund two-way or reverse technical assistance millennial workforce? And third, what do we need to do here to ensure that the millennial workforce from the global south is sitting right next to us in the decision maker's chair 10, 14 years from now? I was sharing these thoughts with one of my good friends who's Ugandan and also serving in Choco, Colombia right now. And she said, Ellie, I think it's reasonable to assume that the millennial workforce in the global north and the developed world will take on the mantle of global leadership for these agendas 14 years from now, but we can't necessarily say the same for their counterparts in the global south. You see, a lot of these people are living under regimes in which entrenched politicians never retire, so that they don't have the opportunity to take on the leadership roles or to exert influence over the policies that would lead to implementation of SDGs. So what we need to do is start a roundtable to bring together millennials from the global north and the global south to have a conversation about this very issue. So my challenge to all of us today is to make that happen. And my parting question for all of us to ask ourselves is, what behaviors, mindsets, attitudes, and aspirations do I need to change in myself to see the world that we want in 2030? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to take a moment before we start our last panel to recognize someone who was not able to join us this morning, and that's Will Rice. Will is Andy Rice's son, who we named the Rice Award after, and Will was on the panel to select today's honorees. Yeah, pull it up. All right, so our final session today should be a lot of fun. As many of you know, Steve Radlett has recently written a book called The Great Surge, focused on the successes we've had in development and what we need to do to keep the good work going. Charles Kenny's in the midst of also writing a book, but it's on the obstacles to success. So both are well known in the circles of development. It's going to be a very interesting conversation between the two of them. Moderating the discussion is Tessie San Martin, the president and CEO of Plan USA, who is also a member of the SID Board of Directors. And Tessie is an extremely well-traveled, well-knowledge professional in international development who's been with APT, the World Bank, and God only knows how many other organizations, Tessie. So please welcome the panel as they come up, Steve Radelet, Charles Kenny, and Tessie San Martin.
I think you're just trying to say that I'm old, but okay. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. I'm keenly aware that we're between you and happy hour, but I also think this is going to be a really terrific panel. I hardly need to do anything. Both these gentlemen have been writing so articulately about foreign aid and aid effectiveness. And what I want to do is ask a few questions to sort of get the ball rolling, but then we want to leave enough time to get the audience engaged and ask a few questions, so be thinking about what you want to ask. I'm not going to introduce them because they're really well known, and Byron has already done that. Let me start by saying, I mean, honestly, one of the things that I like both about, Steve's book, The Great Surge, and Charles's book, Getting Better, is that in the middle of all of this, 24-hour news cycle about all the bad things that are happening, is a great reminder that, in fact, there are a lot of things that are going well, right? And actually, to paraphrase Steve, he said, never before in human history has extreme poverty fallen as quickly as it has over the last few decades. And so, in fact, it is important, with all the things that are not going right, to take a step back and acknowledge the things that are. But I think it's also important to acknowledge, and this is, in fact, the theme of the conference, this issue of inclusiveness, right? So as we're advancing, and as poverty, the proportion of people living under $1.25 a day, as we're, as we see the proportion of, maternal mortality rates drop, the number of children that survive past the age of 5 increase, the proportion increase. As we're seeing all of that, it's also important to acknowledge that as many steps as we're taking forward, we're taking some steps back. And for example, I'm reminded of, Plan does a lot of work in open defecation to prevent that, to eliminate that. And in fact, we've seen a lot of progress, creating communities ODF, and that has great, development benefits, only to see regression. The other example that I read in a recent report that we had was, we all understand the importance of getting girls to school, and in fact, the proportion of girls that between 1995 and 2011, the proportion of girls that are going to school, right, to primary school, or actually the proportion of girls that were not in primary school has actually dropped significantly. Yet in a country like Nigeria, over the last several years, we've actually seen just the opposite, right? The proportion of girls that are not in primary school is actually increasing. So the whole point is, and I'd love to get both of your comments on it, how do, all of this progress has been made, how do we make sure this issue of, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, don't get left behind? And by the way, that's a super long topic, so just a few comments, just to, again, to get the ball rolling, and we'll have a chance to go back to some of these comments. But how do we get our heads wrapped around the fact that for as much progress as has been made, we also see a lot of regression, and then there is the sort of separate topic of, who's actually progressing, and how do you make sure that the most marginalized are not left behind? Steve.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Tessie, and thanks for Catherine. Thanks for everybody for being here. And I don't mind, I don't know if you mind, talking for 2 or 3 days about this. You're not between me and happy hour. It was very nice of you to provide us with these bottles of vodka for our vodka tonics here for our talk. It's a very, very nice thing to do on a hot summer day. There has been incredible progress, and in fact, we're getting more and more inclusive in terms of the reach of development progress. It's just not inclusive enough at this stage. The poverty numbers are falling in more than 60 countries around the world. It's not just a China-India thing. It's happening in Mozambique and in Tanzania and in Ghana and in Brazil and in Colombia and Vietnam and over 60 countries. But that also means there's 40 or 50 where it's not falling. And I do worry when people talk about eliminating or eradicating poverty by 2030. If we continue the current trends, we won't reach it because there are countries in which those numbers are going up. And in those countries, the trend actually has to be reversed before it falls. And that's true with almost all the indicators, that we're seeing this tremendous progress, but in some countries it's going backwards. There's one exception, I think, which is the child mortality rate, which has really struck me because for the data that are available, the rate of child mortality has fallen around the world since 1980 in every single country in the world, period, for which we have data. It's really quite astonishing. It's fallen in the United States, and it's fallen in Denmark, and in the Netherlands, and it's fallen in China, and it's fallen in North Korea, where there's actually a couple of data points. It's fallen in Afghanistan with the data after 2001. It's fallen in every country in the world in which there are data available. And I don't know of any socioeconomic indicator that has improved in every single country in the world over 3 decades, ever, in anything. So that's one that there are fewer exceptions, although there are still 5% of kids, 1 out of 20, that are born that don't make it to their 5th birthday, which is unacceptable. So we've made a lot of progress, but there is still a long way to go. And the challenge is that actually as we make progress, making it more inclusive gets harder and harder and harder. It's not so much that there's been, you can call it low-hanging fruit, not that it's been particularly easy, but the countries where there has been less progress, or the pockets where there has been less progress, those challenges are even greater. In some countries it's geographic, or within countries it's geographic. A lot of people that are left out are so because they are far away from cities, from markets, from population centers. They're in landlocked areas, they're in deserts, but even in countries where there's been great success, even in our own country, people that don't have, that are geographically isolated have disadvantages, and that's true in development. It's disadvantages around gender, where people are left out. It's disadvantages around race or ethnicity. It's disadvantages around access to knowledge. And as we progress, those obstacles are harder and harder to find to get to the people that are included. So the challenge for us going forward is to learn from where we have succeeded and try to apply that to new places, but all the while recognizing that what has worked in other places may not work in the most difficult places. It's not going to work to set up export processing zones that have worked so well in Southeast Asia. It's not going to work in Chad because there's no port, and that's an obvious example. But many of the things that have worked, just because they've worked in other places, doesn't mean they're going to work in the most difficult places. And the real challenge for all of us is to learn and grow and get the knowledge from where we have had success, but then to have the wisdom to be able to figure out, working with local actors, when to apply that and when to recognize actually it's not going to work here, and why, and how we have to be more creative going forward. And that gets harder and harder as we get to people that are more isolated from success.
Charles.
Thanks. I do think that the massive amount of global progress we've seen for a considerable majority of the world's people across a range of measures and all the world's kids, as Steve mentioned, in a way is a moral call to arms. I mean, if we can manage to do it for 90%, we darn well ought to be able to manage to do it for the other 10% too. And so in a way that the progress we have made makes this even more of a morally vital issue of our time. And I'm not a huge fan of the Sustainable Development Goals, I'll admit, but one thing I do think about them is great, is their focus on universality. I think that's absolutely right. To build on what Steve said about child health, the example of child health, I want to give a shout out to a rather underappreciated bit of the development landscape recently. One of the reasons we've seen this ubiquitous progress in child health is we've seen ubiquitous progress against infectious diseases. And a big reason for that is we've seen rollout of vaccination services far in advance of what we've ever seen before. Leaving aside Los Angeles and Silicon Valley, almost everywhere nowadays is vaccinated. It is an incredible achievement. And frankly, we all, if I may, the development community have a, should give ourselves a round of applause for that. But it is also, and crucially, about governments in developing countries who are rolling out services to nearly all of their citizens, even in some of the poorest, most complex environments worldwide. They're getting up to 95% vaccination rates, routine vaccination rates in some of the most poorest and most deprived countries in the world. Governments do a lot wrong, and they can be responsible for hideous human rights abuses. They have their problems. They are also, frankly, the only vehicle for universal access to stuff. And so I think we really, if we're taking this agenda seriously, for all the hugely important role of the private sector, for all the hugely important role of the social sector, we need governments that work.
All right, so I'm going to get back to that. And in fact, I want to start unpacking a little bit about what's behind some of this success. But I wanted to ask you a question. Bill Easterly has been saying, right, that we need to recognize that poverty is not about a shortage of technical solutions. It's not about a shortage of experts, although you've got all the experts here in the room. It's really about a shortage of rights. And in the context of making things work and getting this inclusive growth and getting this sustainability, I wonder if you both actually can comment on that briefly.
Huge fan of Bill and his work, and I think he does raise an issue that too often we sweep under the carpet, which is the centrality of human rights, and we need to be very, very careful that whatever we do, not just aid, but our investment flows, trade flows, and so on, don't support evil leaders to hold their positions. The fact that it came out last week that the German aid agency was supporting Sudan to build centers to keep refugees from leaving the country by locking them up, not a good use of aid. And I think we really have to be very careful about that. It's not the only case you could mention. And I think human rights are not just a powerful force for development. They're also, they're rights. They're hugely important just because they're human rights. So we should value them for that reason alone. All that said, experts, I don't know. Technology, definitely. Athens had a version of democracy, wasn't terribly rich back in 1000 BC, because the technologies they were using to pick olives wasn't terribly advanced. A whole bunch of technologies they didn't have. There weren't very many mobile phones around. I think it is about more than just human rights, however vital human rights are. The broad development story has a lot of elements, including technology, including great ideas about how to run institutions. They need to be adapted, as Steve suggested. What worked in Thailand in 1970 probably won't work in Chad in 2016. But those ideas about how to run things are hugely important to development. So I think there's a whole range of things, some of which involve experts. Maybe not experts in this room, as we just heard. Hopefully more and more over time, experts from South Africa or Tanzania, but people exchanging great ideas is a hugely important part of this story.
Great, thanks. Steve?
So Bill's a very good economist. I always learn things when I read his books. He has an incredibly annoying habit of setting up straw men and telling what all of you believe in ways that are false about what all of you believe, and then knocking down that straw man. He builds this argument that everyone here believes that development is only about technical solutions and that everyone here has no idea about rights and governance. It's pretty insulting, it's wrong, and it's a mischaracterization of all of you and all of the heroes from developing countries that you work with side by side, and I don't think it's a very helpful way to move forward the conversation. Now, what he says is correct in that rights and governance are central, but that's not a new idea. Anybody who spent more than a few days in a developing country, and certainly anyone who's lived there for a year or 2 or 10, knows that institutions and governance and political decision makings and rights are absolutely central. You know, I started out as a Peace Corps volunteer long ago teaching in an all-girls school, and it was pretty evident by week 1 who had access to the schools and who didn't. And that was not a technical solution, it was a local political solution about power and rights. And of course, Amartya Sen wrote about this extensively with Development is Freedom and many other things. And I think there are people who are trained as PhD economists who later in life learn about political economy and believe that others are only learning about it at that point as well. But you know, having said that, as Charles said, the technology is really important. We just talked about vaccines and the fact that that child mortality has fallen in every country in the world. That doesn't happen just because of rights. It happens because of technology combined with governance and people making those vaccines available to their children. You do need technical solutions in terms of how debt relief can work, in terms of how to build a good road, in terms of getting antiretrovirals that will save millions of lives for HIV/AIDS, in terms of residual spraying and bed nets. Those things don't happen just because of rights, they happen because of technical knowledge. But at the same time, of course we know that rights and governance matter. Bill has written extensively about the failures of development progress in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and those were largely, as we look back, failures of governance. That took place in the context of the Cold War. There were very few democracies, there were very few rights, and we, the United States and others, were supporting some pretty bad governments back then. That began to change in the early 90s, and it's one of the big reasons why so many countries have advanced. And by and large, if you look at the countries that have moved towards democratic freedoms versus those that have not, you do a pretty good job of actually finding the countries that have made development progress against those that have not. There are exceptions. China is one, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, but they are the exceptions. The democracies have by and large done well because they are providing rights for girls to go to school. They are providing rights for people to open up their own businesses. They are providing rights for people to speak out and hold their governments accountable. They are providing rights to have discussions about what the right policies are, and those are integral to development. But people who have been working in developing countries have known that for a long time. The World Bank has been working on governance issues since the mid-90s. It's a struggle to talk about these in international forums when we're dealing with different kinds of governments, but that doesn't change the fact that these are central to long-term development progress.
Thanks, Steve. Actually, let me stay with you. In your book, actually, The Great Search, which, by the way, I'm going to do a plug for. It really is a very good read.
I'm not here to sell books, but on www.amazon.com, you can buy 2 books for the price.
Yeah, that's true. They're on special now. But you talk about, you acknowledge, right, that foreign aid is not the most important driver for development, but it has played an important part. And I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the evidence as, you know, in terms of the role for foreign aid.
Yeah. So this is again where I think Professor Easterly, along with Jeff Sachs, who's a good friend and was my teacher and mentor, and in many ways I learned more about development from Jeff than anyone else, but he drives me crazy sometimes too, have not helped in this debate by creating what is at least perceived, even though I don't think either one of them necessarily mean it, but is perceived as the contours of a debate that aid is useless versus aid is everything. And I think Jeff is a little bit mischaracterized, aid is everything, because he has been mischaracterized to say macro shock therapy is everything, investments in health are everything, foreign aid is everything, geography is everything, and just about everything else. He gets excited about whatever he talks about. But anyway, putting that aside, I do think that had created this discussion that you were either on one side or the other. And I've been asked many, many times on foreign aid, are you with Sachs or are you with Easterly? And I have to answer, no, I'm not with either. I'm with the evidence. And I don't think either one can be backed up with the evidence. And too often, especially in the United States and up on Capitol Hill, foreign aid and development get merged as if they're the same thing. There was an article a couple of years ago in Foreign Policy magazine about development failures. And the whole article was about foreign aid. And what they're trying to claim was that foreign aid was a failure, but the headline was development has failed, as if they were exactly the same thing, and that gets intertwined in too many minds. My reading of the evidence, and I've read a lot of it, is as follows. There's no question in my mind about the positive impact of foreign aid on health outcomes, to start with health. There's just no question in terms of the child mortality rates, the maternal mortality rates, getting vaccines to children, antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS, cutting malaria deaths by more than half in the last 15 years, cutting tuberculosis infections by 1/3 in the last 15 years. That just doesn't happen with foreign aid playing a big part of that. It's not all about aid. It's actually about aid working with our governments, working with other governments, working with the United Nations, working with private businesses that supply vaccines, working with local heroes, working with mothers that bring their children to the clinics to get vaccinated. You need all of those pieces to work together. But aid has been central in that, and even the harshest critics of aid, Bill Easterly and Dambisi Moyo, have had to back off and say that they weren't talking about health aid. On agriculture, I think the evidence is pretty strong, especially when you incorporate agricultural technologies, both, of course, the Green Revolution, but more recent technologies around cassava and maize and other things where productivity is going up. The biggest debates are about aid and growth, and most of the research in the last 5 years, not all of it, but most of it in the last 5 years, have found a positive and significant relationship between aid and growth. It's not huge. It's adding on average about 1 percentage point to growth overall in most studies. It varies a little bit, but it takes into account the variation. Aid has worked really well in promoting growth in certain countries, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Mozambique, in Uganda, more recently in Indonesia over the years, by investing in roads, by investing in technologies. But there are places where it's been a massive failure, where millions and millions of dollars were wasted, whether it was in the Philippines under Marcos, or whether it was in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo under Mobutu, or many other places that we can look at. It's easy to find the examples, one or the other. But when you look at the evidence, especially since the end of the Cold War, it's a modest positive impact. It is not the main driver, and we should always stay away from that idea. It's pretty arrogant, actually, for anybody to even think that we as outsiders could be the main drivers of economic growth. The main drivers are good governance, global interconnectedness, globalization, knowledge, and having the institutions that people can thrive and learn. But aid, if it's invested well, can help add to that, especially in the context of working with governments and partners on the ground that we're working with and not fighting with to make progress.
Thanks. And actually, Charles, to continue on this theme, in this very good paper that it's a draft, but it's going to turn into a major motion picture, no, into a novel. It's a very good paper on corruption and development, but which I also recommend people read. But you talk about you remind us, right, that the overwhelming reason for the changes and the progress has not been, and I paraphrase, ODA or charitable giving, quote, from people and governments in rich countries to people and government in poor countries, but efforts of the people and governments of the developing countries themselves. So, and actually, you know, that echoes some of the things that Steve has just been saying. So what does that mean in terms of how we think about foreign aid and how we design and apply foreign aid.
So first, I'd completely agree with Steve, luckily, that on what we know about the evidence of aid. I mean, actually, one of the interesting things over the last few years has been this bunch of different papers that have come out saying that the aid to growth link was stronger than many economists thought 10 years before. That said, we are in a different world, or at least we're moving towards a different world. So mid-90s, aid as a percentage of GDP in developing countries, on average, sort of 2%, which speaks to important but not the main story. Today, it's around 0.6, 0.5%, and it's going downwards. And it's going downwards not just because developed countries aren't being generous enough, they are not, but also because developing countries, yay, are growing fast. See the great surge. So, just going forward, that number, we hope, will continue to decline. And that does speak to the fact that for all the successes of aid in the past, the old model is still going to have to change. Steve spoke about how the evidence is pretty undeniable that aid has had an outsized impact on health. I'd imagine that would probably continue to be true. So maybe there's a sector where we don't need to see too much change. The amount of a government's investment budget in roads or energy, or the sort of the big ticket expensive infrastructure that aid can finance for most countries is just going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So we have to think of other ways to have that kind of impact. That we used to have it by investing in a road. Maybe now we'll have to think of another way of having a similar kind of impact. I think there are a bunch. We still, as a planet, massively underinvest in global public goods of all sorts. Some global public goods are particularly relevant to development. To take an example, microgrid power. If we invested more in trying to come up with new technologies that were designed with developing countries in mind, I think that would be a really useful way to leverage the impact of our development dollars. Obviously, working with the private sector is another way of doing that. But I do think it is a time when we have to go, yes, aid does work. It has worked in the past. Not always. There's a lot of ways today, but aid can work, has worked in the past. Still, that doesn't mean we can rest on our laurels in any sense at all. We have to find ways to keep it working in the future.
So then the advice to aid agencies is what?
Think harder. My short list of things to invest more in would certainly include technologies in general. It would include global pandemic preparedness. The World Bank's done something somewhat interesting around that this week. I don't want to go into the details, but it's thinking in that direction. I'd be thinking about infrastructure solutions that are profitable and can be delivered by the private sector, but may take startup capital or some other things from donors. But others in the room could come up with governance interventions of particular sorts. I think make a lot of sense. Especially kind of global partnerships like the Open Government Partnership. But
yeah,
would you like to add?
Yeah, so I think we have to think hard not only about what we do, but how we do it. In terms of both the substance, but also how money and knowledge and people move. The world has changed very dramatically in the last 25 years, developing countries, and the modalities for foreign aid have not. We still are using a model that was developed during the Cold War when we were working with a bunch of countries that weren't making progress and that we couldn't trust. They were a bunch of corrupt dictators. And we couldn't trust, frankly, the decisions that might be made, and we certainly couldn't trust the handling of money. We now have a situation where we have dozens and dozens of countries that are making great progress, not only economically and socially, but in terms of their capacity, the abilities that they have, the number of really excellent leaders that they have. But we also have a couple of dozen countries that are stuck and not making much progress. And so we're going to need to move towards a greater range of modalities. And I'll come back to that in a second, because all of that is still country-to-country assistance. And I want to come back to that, but I want to pick up on the global public goods. That means moving We do need to invest in global public goods, particularly technology. We are not going to help countries adapt to climate change unless we help them adapt and come up with new sources of off-grid power, of green energy, of new kinds of technology and electricity. We're going to need to figure out how to desalinate water a lot more cheaply. We know how to do it, but it's expensive. If we can bring the cost curve down on desalinating water, it changes everything in a lot of places in the world. We're going to need new technologies in agriculture to have drought-resistant and heat-resistant seeds in the face of climate change. Those kinds of investments don't work in a country-to-country aid system. They work in having some funding that actually does go towards pure research in public goods, going to universities here and in developing countries, working with research organizations, harking back to the way that we did the Green Revolution, which was funding research centers in developing countries, which was so successful. And it's kind of ironic that here we have what is arguably the greatest success in foreign aid ever, and we abandoned the model, which is a little bit weird. And I think we need to go back to that kind of model, which is going to require changing how we move money. But then back to the bilateral assistance, I think in countries that are not making much progress, the poorest of the poor, the failed states, the fragile states, something along the lines of the model that we have now probably makes sense to continue. Yes, we should work on more coordination with aid and with the recipient countries, but I think largely it remains intact. People talk about country ownership and all of that, and I'm not that interested, frankly, in Zimbabwe in asking Uncle Bob what his priorities are for foreign aid money. It actually doesn't make sense. We throw around these terms, you know, ask the government what they want to do, and a lot of failed states, no, wrong. It's actually not the right course of action to give too much country ownership to corrupt dictators where they still exist. So we have to be a little bit careful about how we throw around these terms. It makes a lot of sense in the emerging democracies, where we have countries where their citizens have elected countries, where there are accountability mechanisms, and where people are holding them more accountable. We need to channel our funds and have discussions in ways that reinforce those emerging governance structures. In those countries, we do need to have more of a dialogue in which the governments are in charge, not a donor group run by the World Bank, which occasionally will invite the minister to come along and listen in, but a dialogue actually run by the president or the minister, to which the aid agencies and other development partners are invited, and listen to their priorities. And if they make sense, even if they're not exactly what we would choose to do, we got to go with what they choose to do, because on anything there's always more than one good solution, and we have to be willing to be flexible in those places. And then finally, we need to think in those contexts in particular how we move money. In those countries that are moving forward, that are emerging, that are struggling to build capacity, we need to move our money in ways that actually helps build their institutions of accountability and transparency. And the old model just doesn't work. And we all collectively are going to have to find new models where we can support building those institutions. But frankly, when we go in with a project, a brand new project, and we hire away the best accountants and the best auditors from the government, and we're very happy that we have the best auditor and accountant, we've undermined government capacity. And it's a model that just doesn't work anymore. We're setting up projects outsides of ministries. We need to move into things like USAID's fixed amount reimbursable account or pooled funds that are located in ministries where we're having more dialogue and the money is being channeled in a way that actually helps build government financial institutions, government budgetary systems. I'm not talking about just, you know, blind budget support of writing checks and going away. I am talking about thinking about new creative ways where our funding can actually help support those budget and financial and auditing mechanisms and make sure the best people are working on those and we're supporting it rather than pulling things away. And that's going to take some creativity. There are some good ideas out there, but that's a big part of the agenda in the future, because if we can't build the institutions, the progress isn't going to be sustained.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, that's to your point, Charles, about sort of building government capacity, and without that, you know, nothing.
Could I?
Yeah, please.
Just to take an example of a USAID project that many in the room will know about. in Afghanistan, which has seen this massive progress over the last few years. I think one of the fastest ever increases in life expectancy ever, as well as we can measure it. A lot of that progress has been driven by improvements in child health. A goodly proportion of that progress is linked to the rollout of a basic system of health access funded by USAID through the Ministry of Health in Kabul. The Special Investigator General for Afghanistan reconstruction 2 or 3 years ago said that he wanted that project shut down, not because he doubted the development outcomes, which, may I remind you, were fantastic, but because he didn't really trust the accounting measures in place in the Ministry of Health. Didn't actually have any evidence of corruption, he just didn't trust them. This is a case of using one out of any number of really bad measures of red flags of corruption, and saying, because we've kicked up one or two of these very bad measures of red flags of corruption, we're going to assume there's corruption and we're going to shut down the project. Now, corruption is a real development issue. It is an important thing to deal with. But frankly, so is children dying. And if we're going to get in the way of saving children's lives because certain accounting standards haven't been met, we should just go home. It really frustrates me, the attitude that, in this case, it wasn't a donor, it was an investigator general over a donor, but donors have adopted it far too much themselves, of saying what we're going to measure is receipts, and if we can't measure receipts, we're not going to make payments. We shouldn't be in the business of measuring receipts. We should be in the business of measuring results. And that's not just because that's what we're all here for. We're all here to make sure that fewer kids die, to make sure more kids are in school, to make sure they're learning, to make sure that entrepreneurs have the opportunity to found businesses and make money and live a better life. It's also because, frankly, if you don't measure those results, you can have as many receipts as you want and the corruption can still go on. It just moves the corruption downstream to delivery, where you underdeliver on quality and you make your money off that, off skimping on the cement in the road, or not actually making sure the teachers turn up to deliver. You can't see that in the receipts. The receipts will say the teacher's been paid, the cement has been purchased, but it means the development hasn't happened and the corruption has still happened. So if you aren't measuring receipts, you're not stopping, if you aren't measuring results, you're not stopping corruption. And if you're putting all your energy into measuring receipts, all you're doing is meaning that some programs that are really working well will stop. We've got completely the wrong approach to this. And I absolutely agree with Steve that in most of the countries in which we work, we've got to put much more faith in governments to deliver development. Because frankly, if governments aren't delivering development, it's not going to happen with us or without. And so it's the only sort of choice we have from the point of view of delivering development. But it's also the only way that we'll actually make sure our aid works.
If I can just pick up, because it reminds me of another challenge going forward is, to how we need to evolve. That is something that there are smarter people in the room than me that can help figure this out. There is a big push towards measuring results. We want results. And that is leading, I'm afraid, towards doing what we can measure. Because there are certain things that we can measure well, and other things that we don't know how to measure. And there's a slow movement up on Capitol Hill to move money towards things where we can measure it. And look, I'm a big fan of PEPFAR. There's no question that the PEPFAR program has saved millions of lives. There's no question about it all. There are questions about whether it could have saved even more or could have been done even cheaply, but there's no question that it saved millions of lives. And everybody wants to replicate that success. And not to take anything away from them, but it's very easy to measure the success with antiretrovirals because we buy pills, we give an identifiable person the pill, and they live. That's it. And there's no question about it. We know with certainty if we give them the pills, they live, and if we don't, they die. And we know exactly who the person is, so we can actually bring this person up to Capitol Hill for a hearing and say, you have saved this person's life. And it's true, we have, and it's great, it's wonderful, and I don't want to denigrate that. But As we move away from that, it's harder and harder to measure. Even things like bed nets. We know bed nets save lives, but I cannot actually identify the person whose life has been saved by bed nets. I can't say this one would have died without the bed net, but we can say prevalence has gone way down. As we move further and further away, frankly, into health and education, and certainly into governance and capacity, we don't know how to measure it. We all talk about the importance of capacity building and about governance. How do we measure capacity building? Well, I had a seminar and 10 people showed up, and therefore that, you know, and you've all done that on your aid contracts. They head count who shows up. And we do that because it's the only measure we have, and it's pretty bad. If we're serious about building capacity, and we're serious about improving governance, and we're serious about fighting corruption, we're going to have to continue to push how we measure those. We have some measures of governance, the World Bank governance indicators. We've got some measures of corruption that the World Bank does and Transparency International, and they're okay. They're a lot better than nothing. But we need kind of a new generation of ways to measure these things that are so hard but are so central to development. And capacity building is a really important one. We talk about it all the time and we don't know how to measure it. But I worry that because of that, more and more of the funding we have is going to move away from those things and into the things that we can measure. And if we do that, it's going to undermine over the long term the progress that really matters.
Thank you. Actually, we've got a little bit of time left. Let's take some questions from you all. Yes, and there are mics coming. Chloe, please.
Hi, yes, Chloe Schwenke. I've really liked this conversation. It's been elevating, I'll say that much. The only thing that I'm missing from this conversation is references to civil society. You've been placing a great deal of faith on governments, and I understand the reasons for that, but civil society has quietly been trudging along, filling the spaces where governments have failed. Do you see a role, given the closing space for civil society right now, to continue to support civil society and to see that they still play a vital role?
Okay, Chloe took my question. Yeah.
It hasn't been mentioned only by oversight. I couldn't agree with you more. And we both talked about the importance of governance and transparency and accountability. You can't do that without an active civil society. One of the readers of my book was, the draft of my book was Larry Diamond, who beat it into my head, as he often does, in such a good way. But we can't make this kind of progress without that kind of civil society progress. But the second part of your question was how to support it. And I don't know the answer, but it gets back to what I was just talking about. I worry that we're going to stop providing that kind of support to civil society because we don't know exactly what progress looks like and how to measure progress along the way in strengthening civil society. And as long as that is still the case, we're going to underinvest in it. So I do think that there's a lot of power in numbers, and if you and other people who are imaginative and working in this space can really help think about how we can measure that kind of progress and what it looks like over time, I think it will help enormously. It's hard because, you know, infant mortality, we know what it is, we know how to measure it, and we know what better looks like. But civil society, democracy, accountability, we don't even actually know how to define it, much less measure it very well. And I worry about that. We're going to have to change the conversation in a way that we measure it, but that we're also willing to accept some imprecision. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to support that.
I completely agree. The sort of 20 years ago, the discussion about economic growth was all, well, we know it's not capital and we know it's not labor, so it must be total factor productivity. That is economists speak for the black box we don't understand. We've kind of changed the language, but it's pretty much the same. Now we just call it governance. And you know, that's the thing that development economists, yeah, it's important. And I do think, you know, especially development economists, but also more broadly, we have to get better at measuring it. And you know, without a functioning civil society, you cannot have a functioning democracy. So, absolutely agreed. And apologies that it hasn't come up before.
Other? Yes, please.
Michael Jarvis with the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, and thanks to you both. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really appreciated your emphasis on government systems and this shift, as we see declining aid and an emphasis on domestic resource mobilization, that means budgets and taxes. And I wish I could have cloned myself today, because there's a conference at the World Bank going on international tax cooperation to benefit developing countries.
You picked the right one.
Yeah,
I did. And I can guarantee that this one is far better attended, but that's part of my issue. I would very much welcome your thoughts on how do we better link these communities? Because there are people working on those things, but they're very siloed. They don't, too often they're not connected into the types of conversations we're having in this room, and I think that is a risk, and maybe if we were, we could be better reinforcing the case and coming to some of this evidence that you were talking to is lacking when you get to some of these more nebulous concepts. Thanks.
So, Michael, by the way, before his current position, was in the bank working on a whole bunch of governance issues, one of which is a passion I share, which is around governments publishing the contracts that they sign with the private sector. The reason being, citizens paid for this stuff, they should know what they're meant to get, and then they can actually compare it to what they do get. And it's, I think, an incredibly powerful tool for improving the function of governance and giving civil society a whole bunch of ammunition with which to fight against weak governance outcomes. We've actually seen it work in countries including Slovakia, where recently the flower budget of one of the ministries went down quite dramatically after it was turned out they were spending quite a lot of money on flowers. A trivial example, but seriously, it has a big impact on the quality of government service provision. I think that there is an recognition of a set of issues around tax and budgeting that people who work in aid for a living don't deal with terribly much, partially because of the whole dysfunction of a sector that far too often is creating parallel systems. So they know that you all know, the USAID budget regulations very well, but don't know very much about what's going on in developing countries in the sector unless they happen to be experts on that topic. And the more we move aid towards something that's being delivered on budget in developing countries, I think the closer these communities will get.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's very hard how we address this issue of siloing. And it's not actually an issue about foreign, this is an issue in all kinds of organizations. Actually, we have this conversation at Georgetown all the time about the economists and the political scientists and the anthropologists. But in development, we see it all the time. And I see this when I give talks on my book, and people who are health experts, when I talk about the improvements in health, they know all about that. That doesn't surprise them, but they have no idea about the spread of democracy or the reduction in violence, or vice versa. Or people will know about a particular country. I'll hear people say, oh, I've been working in Bolivia for a long time, and I knew that there had been progress there, but I had no idea that parts of sub-Saharan Africa had been making progress. So we get siloed, and it's a human nature thing, I think, in terms of how we work and the capacities of the brain in terms of what we can digest. And there is a trade-off, right? Because the more you specialize, the deeper you can go and really build some expertise. And when you try to bridge across different fields and bring people together, you can't go as deep. So there is a real trade-off in trying to do this. But none of that is particularly helpful to answering your question. I think the answer, to the extent we can, it requires real leadership by whoever is organizing efforts on the ground, whether that's the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Health or the head of a USAID team or a contractor, whoever it is, to have the understanding that you need to bring people together in certain ways to learn from each other and to bring these things out. And we do know that if you can put the engineers together with the economists and with the lawyers and bring people together, it's hard and it's awkward and we speak the wrong language, but the different languages, but we can learn from each other. But I don't know the answer to how we do that, other than where I have seen it work. It's because there was a smart leader who said, for this problem we need to get a different group of people together who are talking across lines. I wish I had a better answer, but I don't.
Let's take a couple of questions. Neil, and yes.
It's hard to see.
Woman, yeah, it is hard to see. You back there, yes.
Thank you, thank you. You mentioned a point about Capitol Hill and how the measurement is becoming siloed to specifics. So if I can extend that conversation to, given it's election year, that I'm also concerned about public perception because that is directly related to the Capitol Hill because that's where ultimately they listen to. So my conversation is that when we see the huge amount of population within the United States and also globally, there are misperception about development, right? So in terms of what we actually achieve. And when I look at how many people bought your books, I'm sure everybody here, if they're not, they would buy tomorrow. But the question is—
2 copies.
Yeah.
How can we— this is what my biggest concern, if you look at not just the United States, globally, Germany, Austria, what's happening in terms of public perception, right? About how do you reach out to the population, not who is in this room. I always feel we are preaching to the choir. How do we really reach out to people who really need to know some of the statistics? If you can give some thoughts.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, hang on, let me
ahead.
just take
Yep.
another question, just in the interest of trying to get, and then, so let's remember that one.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, you touched on failed and fragile states, and I just wanted to bring in this conversation, like the example of Burundi as now at the very bottom of the UNDP indicators, toppling into civil conflict and war with a government kind of almost at war with its own people and the opposition party. Like, it seems our tools are failing us, and even European pressure is not having any effect. So how do we interact? Because there's refugees, fleeing from the situation.
Okay, so that question and Neil's question on how do we get beyond the echo chamber?
I wish I knew the answer to the
Yeah,
Burundi
it's
question,
such a
to be
hard
honest.
question.
So to take what turns out to be the easier question.
Capitol Hill, the easy question.
The survey evidence is that Steve and I have both failed. I think we're both trying to write books that would reach out to more general audiences. So it's too early for Steve's book to have failed. My book's failed. If you survey people in the United Kingdom and you ask them, is the world getting better? A whopping 8% say yes. If you do it in the States, I think the number's a bit better, but not much. If you do it in France, well, it's France, but it's 3%. It's fairly grim. Most people out there definitely do have a different view of the world. And frankly, it is a problem because good news is boring. This is a whole bunch of stuff not happening, right? It's people not getting shot, people not starving, people, waking up in the morning, going to school, having a nice day, coming home, having dinner and going to bed. Fascinating. News at 10. So it is a problem. There is some recent research on what gets picked up on Facebook, which suggests periodically people actually do like sharing a positive story. Most of the time, if they're sharing news stories, it's something negative, but everybody sort of 1 in 3, 1 in 4. So maybe our only option is to try and up the percentage of those stories that are about development as compared to a cat that can play the piano. And if somehow we can get the cat that can play a piano market to pay a little bit of attention to kids not dying from malaria, then we'll break through and Capitol Hill will listen.
So let me try on both of these. So I think that's a really good start. I think there's something about human nature that we always want the negative. We're attracted to what's going wrong. If it bleeds, it leads. That's nothing new. But I do think we can do a better job. And 2 specifics come to mind. The best organization that you all know about that does this is the USGLC, the U.S. Global Leadership Council, because Liz Schreier is a master. And what she does is bring across a little bit slightly different communities, although slightly different ones that Mike was talking about. She brings together the development community, the business community, and the military security community to talk about the importance of development. And she reaches around the country and reaches out to grass tops leaders. She does an excellent job of getting members of Congress to write in their local newspapers, mayors, and other local leaders, church leaders, to speak about the importance of development. And she's onto something, and I think it's really important. A second specific example that I know of, very small but powerful, the Aspen Institute every year sponsors a number of congressional delegations to go visit different countries, rich countries as well as poor countries. Sometimes they go to Moscow or to Tokyo or wherever. And I've had the privilege of going with them twice now to Sub-Saharan Africa, once to Addis and once to Tanzania. And we had in each case about 20 members of Congress, some of whom had traveled, and this was nothing particularly new, but many of them who had never actually seen it. And to see the vibrancy of developing countries, to see the capacity and the progress and the energy and the smarts on the ground, to meet capable leaders, to go see a USAID-funded project, to go see Peace Corps volunteers and what they're doing. And it makes a remarkable difference, actually, if they see it. Now, that's expensive, it's hard, but you can do that with Congress. At least it's a limited number of people. And every time they do this, by the way, it's a bipartisan group. They bring Democrats and Republicans. They go for a week. They spend the mornings discussing issues around economics or politics, security, and then spend the afternoons going to see things. But there's nothing more powerful for our senior leaders on the Hill than to go and visit and see. And it shouldn't just be framed, by the way, about go see our successful aid finance projects. It should be framed around go see a country that's really doing great stuff and meet their leaders and meet their local heroes. And by the way, we're supporting this progress. And that kind of frame works really well. Your question on Burundi, I mean, we're a little silent on it because it's such a hard question. And the answer is we don't know the answer. And it's not just about Burundi, it's about the many countries that unfortunately over the years, over the decades, have spiraled into senseless conflict. And the hard fact is that in any society, a small number of people that are willing to kill can do an amazing amount of damage, and we don't know how to stop it. But countries, the poorest countries in the world, partly because they are poor, they don't have the funds to invest in good security infrastructure and good institutions of governance, are particularly prone to these kinds of disasters. And we don't know how to do it very well. The few places where it has worked well are places where the international community has been willing to impose security and order. At the end of the day, a state, a nation, is defined by a group having a legal monopoly on power. That's what defines a nation state. And it's around the defense and security apparatus because that is so central to establishing the rule of law and to holding back those minority of people that are willing to do violence so that the majority of people can get on with their lives. And in countries that fall apart, that security apparatus falls apart, if it ever existed. And so the few places where I've seen progress happen are places like, I'm thinking a lot about Liberia. I don't know much about Burundi, but I know a fair amount about Liberia, where I've been 30 or 40 times now over the last couple of decades. And it was a place every bit as bad. But the international community, first through the auspices of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and then the United Nations under the Blue Helmets, came in and provided sufficient security to stop the violence and to allow development to get started. And it's taken, in Liberia, it's now been 13 years since Charles Taylor went into exile in Nigeria. It takes a long time, and and the Blue Helmets are still there. The UN peacekeepers are still there because it takes that long to actually rebuild the security apparatus and the legal institutions to allow progress to go forward. But we can't, I'm not claiming we can do that or should do that in every country. Where to go in and where not to go in is a difficult situation. And so there's no easy answer to these situations. But I do believe pretty strongly that in the absence of some kind of security apparatus, that it is really impossible for people to proceed. And how we do that is a very, very difficult question. I wish it was easier, but I don't know.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to have to bring this to an end. You said at the beginning that we could go on for 3 days, and I believe we could, because this has been really interesting. And I think everybody agrees. Listen, I guess, I've got a few takeaways from this conversation. The success that we've had, and we have had success, has, to both your points, taught us a lot about, what works and what doesn't, and should be informing what we do in the future. And there's no question that we're going to have to think differently about what we continue to fund and where we continue to fund it, and how we work, with governments and other partners. And this is going to, certainly for our community here, imply that we're going to really need to rethink and retool, because as much success as we've had in the past, what's going to determine the success that we have in the future is probably going to be different. If we take nothing else, let's take that, and please join me in thanking our terrific speakers.
Thank you, Tessie, and thank you, Steve and Charles. And I noticed that Steve's vodka bottle is empty. Yep. And so I hope you'll all join him across the hall at our reception to have a refill. And thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you.